Welcome in, everybody, to another deep dive. Today we're going to be focusing on, well, how philosophy bumps up against current events.
Yeah, exactly. Kind of where those two worlds collide, And we've got a really interesting mix today. Articles, blog posts, even a tweet that caught my eye. So it'll be fun to kind of see what gems we can pull out of this and, what questions they raise for us.
Absolutely. And speaking of current events,
Yeah.
the plane crash in D.C., obviously a horrible tragedy, 67 lives lost.
Right.
And a philosopher's blog kind of uses that as a jumping off point to look at, how different presidents have responded to tragedies over the years.
Yeah, I thought it was an interesting take because, they pointed out that you've got presidents like Reagan and Obama, in the past, who really focused on bringing the country together during these events, kind of emphasizing unity and healing. And they contrasted that with, well, I guess we could say a more recent president.
Right.
Who seemed to maybe even intentionally use these kinds of events to, stir up division.
Yeah, and it's interesting, right? Because it makes you think about, does a leader have a responsibility to console?
Yeah.
To try to unify?
Yeah.
Or is it enough to just acknowledge what happened?
Right. Is there an ethical obligation there?
Yeah. What do you think as far as that goes? What's the responsibility?
It's a tough question. And the blog post doesn't really come down hard on one side or the other.
Right.
But I think it does make us, think about the power of language, especially when you're in that kind of position.
For sure.
And how, those words can really impact the whole national conversation.
Absolutely. So moving on to a different kind of powerful figure, James in Philosophy Refreshed had this really provocative analysis of Elon Musk and that whole Sieg Heil gesture thing at the inauguration. I don't know if you saw that.
I did. And that blog post, it was a wild ride. They compared Musk not to Hitler, but to Hugo Boss.
Wow.
The guy who designed the Nazi uniforms.
Interesting comparison.
Yeah. It's not saying Musk is, the same as a fascist dictator, but it's looking at the way that even subtle actions, especially from someone with that much wealth and influence, can kind of normalize or even endorse these harmful ideas.
It really makes you think about, if you're supporting a certain leader, regardless of what they're saying or doing, does that make you complicit in a way?
Complicit is a strong word, but I think it definitely raises questions about, ethical responsibility.
Yeah.
Especially when you have that kind of platform.
And, what does all this say about the ethics of tech innovation?
Yeah.
Because Musk is obviously a huge player in that world.
It's not just about the technology itself, right? It's how it's used.
Right.
Who controls it.
Yeah.
And whether we're really thinking through the potential for misuse.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So let's shift gears a little bit and talk about something maybe a little closer to home. Exoskeleton ethics. Work. Another piece from a philosopher's blog looks at the ethics of using exoskeletons.
Oh, this is a fascinating one.
Yeah. In different industries.
Yeah.
And on the surface, it sounds like a pretty positive thing, right? Increased productivity.
Right. Reduce injuries.
Less workplace injuries. But the author brings up some concerns that I hadn't really thought about.
Well, yeah. It makes you wonder, could employers start pressuring workers to push themselves even harder now that they have these devices?
Yeah. You're not limited by your own physical strength anymore.
Exactly. And then there's the whole economic side of it. What happens if only some workers can afford these exoskeletons? Does that create a new kind of inequality?
And even beyond those things, what other unintended consequences could we see?
Yeah.
What about wages? What about de-skilling certain jobs?
Yeah.
The psychological impact of relying on these devices. There's so many questions.
It's definitely a Pandora's box in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
A lot to unpack there. And it's a good reminder that, progress isn't always a straight line.
Right.
There are always trade-offs to think about.
Absolutely. And, speaking of unintended consequences, there was this other piece in a philosopher's blog that really got me thinking.
Which one was that?
It's called Trophy Hunting for Conservation.
Oh, yeah. That's a controversial one.
I know, right? And I have to admit, when I first saw the title, I was like, wait, what?
Yeah.
Trophy hunting? Like, how can that possibly be good for conservation?
It seems counterintuitive.
Totally.
Yeah.
But then I read the article, and it actually makes a kind of compelling argument.
Well, the basic idea is that the money from those hunting permits and fees, that often goes directly to funding conservation programs.
So they're using that money to protect the species as a whole?
Exactly. It's kind of like the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few kind of thing.
But it's still tough,
right?
Because you're basically saying it's okay to kill a certain number of these endangered animals.
Yeah, it definitely raises some ethical red flags.
For sure. You know, is it really a necessary compromise?
Right.
Are there other ways to protect these animals that don't involve, killing them?
I mean, ideally, yes. But the reality is that conservation often comes down to money.
That's true.
And if this is a way to generate those funds, then maybe it's something we have to consider.
It's definitely a tough call. And I think it speaks to a larger point about, conservation in general.
What do you mean?
That there aren't always easy answers.
Oh, for sure.
And that we need to be willing to have these difficult conversations and explore all the options.
Absolutely. Even the ones that might make us uncomfortable.
Exactly. So let's switch gears again and talk about something a little more meta.
Meta? How so?
Well, I was browsing after dinner conversation, and they have this best of anthology coming out.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. And it's all philosophy-themed short stories.
I like that idea.
Me too.
Yeah.
I've always felt like fiction is such a powerful way to explore these big ideas.
Well, it makes it more relatable, right?
Totally. You're not just reading about some abstract concept. You're experiencing it through the eyes of a character.
And feeling those emotions.
Exactly. So it's like doing philosophy, but in a different way.
More engaging.
For sure.
Yeah.
And speaking of engaging with philosophy, I saw this tweet from Pauliston Murphy Pam.
Okay.
With a quote from Bertrand Russell. It said, "The only way to find out what philosophy is to do philosophy."
That's a good one.
Right. And it really got me thinking, because on the one hand, I totally agree. You can't just read about it. You have to actually wrestle with the questions yourself.
Right. You got to get your hands dirty.
Exactly. But on the other hand, I also wonder if we can learn by watching other people do philosophy.
Observing their process.
Yeah. Like, can we glean insights from that? Or is it really only through our own personal engagement?
It's a good question. And it actually ties in nicely with something I saw on Daily News.
Oh, yeah. What was that?
They were talking about this new interactive visualization of philosophy.
Okay.
And it basically maps out the connections and disagreements between different philosophers throughout history.
So you can see how these ideas have evolved over time.
Exactly. It's like a family tree of philosophical thought.
That's awesome.
Yeah. And it really shows how, philosophy is not this static thing. It's a conversation that's been going on for centuries.
And we're all part of it.
Exactly.
And, it's a reminder that we can all participate in that conversation.
Absolutely. Whether we consider ourselves philosophers or not.
Exactly. So as we wrap up this deep dive into, current events and all the philosophical questions they spark,
I think the big takeaway for me is that philosophy, it's not just some, abstract academic thing.
Right.
It's woven into the fabric of our lives.
It's everywhere. We're making philosophical choices every day, whether we realize it or not.
Exactly. And the more we can, bring those choices into the light, the more conscious we can be.
And I think that's what this whole deep dive is really about, right?
What do you mean?
Well, it's about recognizing those philosophical moments in our everyday lives.
Yeah.
And engaging with them thoughtfully, critically, really wrestling with those questions.
It's about being an active participant.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Not just a passive consumer of information.
So as we leave you today,
yeah,
we want to leave you with a challenge.
I like it.
In this world that's just overflowing with information, competing narratives, how do you decide what's truly worth learning?
What are the frameworks, the principles you use to kind of sift through it all?
To make sense of the chaos.
And ultimately to form your own conclusions.
So keep questioning, keep exploring.
I'm diving deep.
And thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
We'll see you next time.
you.